Welcome back to the House of History. This is Professor Santangelo coming at you again from my basement. I hope you're all doing well. And here we are for the lecture for March 31st. This is a one lecture night, although it's a long lecture. So you can dig in, get some popcorn, and enjoy the show. So tonight, I'd like to start out by just talking about just one little thing, and then we'll get into the specifics. You know, one of the things that's hard when you're teaching history, when you're trying to get people like yourselves to understand about people in the past, it's hard to get folks around the idea that they are just like the people that they're studying in the past. It's a very difficult concept, really. When you hear about Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, whoever, it's very difficult for people today, or really anybody, to think about folks from earlier time periods and not have the feeling of, oh, they're just like me. I could talk to that guy. We could hang out. We could go for a beer. We would sit around and chat, and I'd catch them up on the last couple hundred years, and all would be well. And the reality is that although in some very fundamental ways people are still the same, people fall in love, people need to eat, people are very communal, which is making our current times very difficult. Nevertheless, in so many fundamental ways, the world has changed a lot just in the last 100 years, really in my own lifetime, and I'm half 100 years. And certainly, people from 300 or 400 years ago, if you tried to communicate with them, if you tried to talk to them, it would be very difficult because they really think very differently. They live very differently. Um, it's not that they're not people, it's just that they're very different people. And so I can say that as much as I want, but you're going to have to believe me sometimes. But if there's one class, if there's one lecture in which I think I can probably make that point come true, it will be in tonight's lecture where we talk about the Puritans, because although you personally may be quite religious, you may know people who are quite religious. And there are, of course, many people in this country and the world who are very fundamentally religious at their core. It's going to be hard to find someone, I suspect, who takes religion as seriously and as fundamentally as the Puritans do, who we'll be talking about in their establishment of the Puritan colonies of the 1600s. So keep that thought in the back of your mind as we dig through some of the religious controversies and the history of religion. When you're done here, you'll know more about religion than you ever wanted to know. Or maybe not. Okay, so we'll pick up the story in Europe first before we get over to England and to sort of get a quick idea of what was going on in the religious history of Europe. I mentioned previously that the dominant religion of Europe for centuries was the Roman Catholic Church. There had been a split, and the eastern part of Europe centuries earlier had broken off into what are the Orthodox churches. So the Greeks and the Russians and people around there in the very eastern part of Europe had become a different brand of Christianity. But otherwise, the Catholic Church was the dominant entity in people's lives for essentially a millennium. And then that began to change in Europe, in the main part of Europe, in the 1500s. A monk named Martin Luther in 1517 publicly raised a series of objections to what he considered to be corruption within the Catholic Church. This led to major controversy. He started this in what's now Germany, and spreading from there in the decades and eventually century that followed. He and others felt that the Catholic Church was too corrupt an institution to stay within, and they broke away from it because Luther and the other people who objected to the Catholic Church were protesting things that they felt were wrong about Catholicism. They are generically, as a group, referred to as the Protestants. And therefore, the churches that they developed, which are all Christian churches, all based on the same fundamental beliefs in Jesus and the Bible and the other things that other Christians all over the world believe, these group of Protestants, of whom all the different non-Catholic denominations that exist today basically go back to, these people began to separate away from the Catholic Church. And essentially what happened after that with Luther and a guy named John Calvin, whose ideas are very important, he lived in Switzerland, these and other figures led people in different parts of Europe away from the Catholic Church, and Europe essentially broke in half over religious differences. More or less the way that worked in the 15 and 1600s is that the farther away from Rome you were, the more likely you were to break off into some sort of Protestant faith. So the more northern and the more western parts of Europe became Protestant in one form or fashion, the more southern and the more eastern parts of Europe, not all the way to the Orthodox areas, those stayed in the Catholic Church. And then, of course, the Catholics and the Protestants fought over each other. Especially, they fought over the areas where there sort of were about equal numbers. The way this normally works is that it's really not up to individual people to get to choose, because that's not the way the world works in those days. But instead, it'd really be the key would be what your monarch decided, your king, your duke, your earl, your lord, your czar, whatever it might be. If that person chose to stay Catholic, then that area would stay Catholic. If that person decided to become some sort of Protestant, then that area becomes some sort of Protestant. And that was what was happening in Europe. And the Protestants are developing all kinds of changes in the study of religion and some of the fundamental principles of Christianity, the way it is practiced. Now, the story is a little bit different in England. England, at first, is the exception that proves my rule about the Protestant Reformation, as it's called, because England is, of course, a very northwest country in Europe. And so, by the standards that I just set, that would mean that England should have been a Protestant country. But, as I said, the leadership is really the key. And in the early 1500s, the King of England, Henry VIII, who I previously mentioned, Henry VIII was a close ally with the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church. And Henry VIII therefore kept England in the Catholic Church, even as some of their neighboring countries became more Protestant, especially the countries on the other side of the English Channel. So, as a result, Henry VIII felt that this meant that he should have some special status with the Pope. And as he got a little bit older, Henry VIII started to get concerned, among other things, about the fact that he had no male sons. He had daughters, but he didn't have any male heirs. This is a problem because England had had all kinds of instability in the previous, really, couple of centuries, off and on, and a lot of that instability was about who was going to rule England and how. And there had his own father had taken the throne after some of these controversies, and so he was concerned that if he didn't leave an obvious male heir after him, that this would lead to instability, and that instability could even creep into the period when he was still alive. He also, I have to say, had his eye on somebody other than his actual wife. He was married, had been married in the Catholic Church, as a good Catholic did, but at some point his eyes wandered, and he decided that there was another woman that he was interested in. And for some reason, maybe she looked like she was going to give him boys as children, or maybe he just liked the way she looked, or whatever. So Henry VIII approached the Pope and requested that the Pope grant him not a divorce, because divorce doesn't happen in the Catholic Church, but an annulment, which is basically to say that the marriage never happened. However, since they'd had children, obviously the marriage had happened, and the Pope was not going for this, and so the Pope refused, which upset Henry VIII tremendously. They went back and forth for a little while, but eventually the very strong-willed Henry VIII decided, you know what, forget it, forget you. I'm taking my marbles and I'm going to go play with somebody else. And so in the 1500s, Henry VIII pulled England out of the Catholic Church, and of course the Pope wasn't very happy about that, and established his own church. Officially, it's called the Church of England, but it is referred to as the Anglican Church, basically a synonym for English. The Anglican Church, established by Henry VIII in the 1500s, was established basically to respond to the specific concerns that he had. And so you would not be surprised to hear that divorce was okay in the Catholic Church, in the Anglican Church. And so not long after the Anglican Church was established, Henry VIII divorced the first wife, married that other woman he had his eye on. That one didn't work out either, and by the time he died, he was on his sixth wife. So there you go. Lesson there, I'm not sure what it is. The other thing, of course, is that in the Catholic Church, the Pope is the boss, but in the Anglican Church, the King of England is the boss. Specifically, the King of England is the leader of the church and then appoints a religious leader, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who then establishes all the other positions, the bishops and so forth, who then administer the church. Having himself as the leader, of course, put him in an important position of power, and then he could give allies some of these other positions that they could administer the church, and that made the transition a lot easier. So the Anglican Church, established by Henry VIII, is kind of a Protestant church in that it's not a Catholic church. Still Christian, of course, but in many other ways very similar to the Catholic Church that they had left. If you've seen recent royal weddings, and I don't know why anyone in America watches those things because I thought we had a revolution to not have to do that. But if you have, because it seems like we all do, then you've seen that the grand places where these weddings happen and the other places where the big churches are and the cathedrals and so forth in England, they look a lot like Catholic churches, especially like the big Catholic cathedrals. They're grand. They have the same sort of colors and tapestries, the painted windows, a lot of the same iconography. They have a very similar feel to them. The ministers are dressed in a similar way to Catholic priests. Of course, it turns out they can get married. That's one significant difference, also. But otherwise, the look and feel of the Anglican Church is not so different from the Catholic Church because Henry VIII, who established the Anglican Church, did not have any deep philosophical problems with the Catholic Church. He just wanted to get out of it. Now, the thing is that there were people in England who wanted something deeper, bigger changes in the church because they despised the Catholic Church for the same reason that Martin Luther and John Calvin and the other Protestant leaders of the 1500s, for the same reason that those people were upset with the Catholic Church. These people felt that the Anglican Church that had been established by King Henry VIII was simply not pure enough. It was not enough of a Protestant change and therefore would not lead the people of England in the right direction with regards to religion and their faith. So, these folks, these people who are religious zealots, religious reformers, their goal is to reform the Anglican Church, to change it, to make it a better church, one more holy and one more in keeping with what they felt religion should be. They had a specific series of objections to what they saw in the Anglican Church. Uh, they objected to the way the churches looked. They thought the churches were too grand. They thought the churches looked too much like Catholic churches, didn't have the kind of simplicity that they were looking for in their religion. They didn't like the Mass, the Sunday Mass, which Catholics go to and which other Protestants go to as well. They didn't like the fact that it was complicated. They didn't like the fact that it was hard to understand. The people who were going to Mass every Sunday didn't really understand what was going on. They just sort of go through the motions. They mumble and repeat what they're told to mumble and repeat. They sing along to the songs, but they aren't necessarily really getting and understanding on a deep level all the complexities of what's going on. So the Puritans are looking for something a little more people-centered and easier for them to understand. They also don't like the look of the church. There are things that are happening at the Anglican faith services that bother them. They didn't like the fact, for example, that at various times the congregants, which is the regular people, that they would kneel, which is also something that happens in Catholic services. This bothered them because they were convinced that this gave the wrong impression. Somebody looking in through the stained glass window might see the regular people, the ordinary people, kneeling, and the minister, the leader of the church, not kneeling but standing, and the body language looks as if everybody ordinary in the community is kneeling down before that minister, as if that minister is the most important person and everyone else is kneeling before them. The symbolism is supposed to not be that people are kneeling before the minister, but instead kneeling before the awesome majesty of God or something like that. But that symbolism was not something that was immediately obvious, and therefore the Puritans, the reformers, really wanted these changes. They also didn't like the way the ministers look. The ministers are dressed differently from everybody else. They're dressed up in many ways. They're wearing special clothes that no one else is allowed to wear, colors that were not available for most regular, ordinary people, elaborate outfits, vestments that normal people do not wear, would never get to wear. And again, that seems to be some sort of a distinction, a separation, and maybe putting these people on a pedestal. And in fact, at the churches, whether they're Anglican churches or Catholic churches, the minister or the priest for a Catholic service, they're raised up. They're on a pedestal. Again, it's the symbolism seems to be that they're better than everybody else. And they're also separated from everybody else because Anglicans, there is a communion rail separating everybody else from the place where all the business is happening, where the minister and maybe the other people helping out the minister are in their raised up platform. The minister comes down and gives communion to the congregants, but basically the is always going to be separated as the congregants come forth and essentially thank the minister for giving them communion. All of this rankled the Puritans of England, who were convinced that the Anglican Church was too complicated, was too similar to the rites and rituals of the Catholic Church, was really not a people centered church at all, and not a church that people truly could understand. Instead, the Puritans want changes in England similar to some of the fundamental changes in religion that they saw going on among the various Protestant faiths in the mainland of Europe, in places like Germany, in places like Switzerland, and other parts of Europe. They were looking for a more people centered religion, a simpler religion, one that was more like the way the apostles and the other early leaders of the church, the kind of religion that they celebrated, if you go back to the early days of the church. They're looking for simpler ceremonies, they're looking for simpler structures, they're looking for simpler rituals, they're looking for a kind of church ceremony that people can understand and get involved in. They don't really think that Mass needs to be as complicated. They don't think that communion should happen maybe even every week, just sometimes. They don't think that the churches should look so grand, which are also expensive and hard for the congregants to afford. They don't think that there should be so much separation between the regular people, the congregants, and the ministers who are running the show. The goal of the Puritans is to make it as simple and people centered as possible. One of the things the Puritans wanted to emphasize, based on some of the ideas that other Protestants in the mainland of Europe emphasized, was to study the Bible. For Christians, the Bible is the fundamental book. It is the fundamental words and authority of the religion, coming from ancient times for the Old Testament, dating back to Moses, and from more recent, but still at this point quite old times, the time that the New Testament, the stories of the life of Jesus and the apostles after his resurrection. Um, as far as Christians are concerned, this is the fundamental principle of the church, all summed up in the Bible. These are holy words, and therefore fundamental to understanding of the religion. Protestants in the mainland of Europe and Puritans living in England felt that the real way to get at and understand one's responsibility as a Christian was to focus on the Bible. And therefore, Bible study, which anybody could do, anyone literate could do, and main European Protestants as well as the English Puritans emphasize literacy because it's important to understanding the Bible. One should be able to read the words of God, is the theory there. Um, Protestants and then the Puritans here in England emphasize Bible study and therefore emphasize that religion should be a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, 365 days of a year kind of a thing, not something that you do once a week. You dress up, you go to church, you stand up, you sit down, you sing some songs, you go forth, you walk out again, and then sort of your responsibility for the week are over, but it hasn't necessarily altered the way truly you live your life. Bible study and trying to understand the ideas of the Bible and how the Bible affects everyday life and relates to everyday life, the Puritans were convinced that this was the true way, the best way to emphasize a religion. They also want to make sure that the sermons that the ministers are delivering at church every Sunday, that these are focused on an understanding of the Bible and connecting that to local concerns. Because another thing that the Puritans really were bothered by was the fact that there was a lot of outside control in the Anglican Church. People really had no say over who their ministers were, over how money was raised, or how that money would be spent, or a lot of the day to day runnings of the church. Therefore, the Puritans are hoping for some sort of local control where the local concerns would be something that would be reflected in how the church would be run, in who was running and managing their local congregation, and also in what would be discussed in the church each Sunday. So you put all that together, and the Puritans had some fundamental differences with the way the Anglican Church was being run. There were never a huge number of Puritans. The Puritans were always a minority within England. They are religious zealots who are criticizing the king and criticizing the dominant religion of the country, which is dangerous. And so, therefore, Puritans are going to be people who are convinced that they are right, that they are not just right but righteous, that they are on the right track, inspired by what they saw going on in other parts of Europe, inspired by a faith that they felt, inspired by the Bible, and inspired by what they felt were some mistakes in the Anglican Church that needed to be corrected. Now, within the Puritan subgenre, within the Puritan group, they're not really separate religion. They are sort of a faith group. Within the Puritans as a community, there were essentially two strands of thought. The smaller, never very large minority within the minority were the ultra radicals who were convinced that the Anglican Church simply could never be reformed, that it was simply too corrupt, that it was too similar to the Catholic Church, which they despised. And therefore, trying to work within it was not only a bad idea, it was dangerous. It was dangerous to the soul. It was something that was going to lead to the corruption and destruction of any good hearted people. And therefore, the more radical minority group of Puritans felt they needed to establish completely separate churches where they could worship the way they knew that they needed to do. The problem, of course, is that to do this is illegal because when the Anglican Church was established by Henry VIII and then continuing through the reign of Elizabeth I and afterwards, the law of the land was these Anglican churches are the only churches that will be allowed. And to try to set up anything other than that is running the risk of being arrested, thrown in jail, and who knows, even worse. So, the most radical, smallest group of Puritan reformers want to separate out from the Anglican Church, and they're referred to as separatists. The majority of the Puritans were not quite that radical. Compared to the rest of their neighbors, they are very different. Their religious ideas are different. The emphasis that they live their lives, very different. The fervor that they felt is very different. But compared to the ultra Puritans of the separatists, the majority of the Puritans felt that the Anglican Church was something that you could work within and try to reform. This would be less dangerous, of course, because you're less likely to be arrested. But the so called non separatist Puritans, the majority of the Puritans, they felt that if they could slowly gain control over local congregations, whether that was getting some of their leadership in control of or as ministers in some congregations, or just becoming a majority group within a particular community, that they could then slowly, community by community, congregation by congregation, really church by church, that they could expand their ideas and bring others to what they considered to be the correct way of worshiping. This would be slower. This was less radical and less dangerous because it was less likely to lead them to run afoul of the laws of England. And it also means that they don't have to worry about getting arrested. Now, the separatist Puritans did try at first to establish some separatist churches in England. This is way too dangerous. They're going to get rounded up by the government. There really aren't that many of them. They number in the small hundreds. And so, therefore, it was not a huge leap of logic for the separatist Puritans to decide that they should just leave England entirely. And so, in the early 1600s, most of the separatist Puritans did just that. They got up and they left England. Now, they didn't go where you may be thinking of because there was an intermediate step. In the northern part of Europe, just across the English Channel, the Netherlands, which I've spoken of already when we talked about some of the colonies that were established, the Netherlands, a fairly recently independent country, a Protestant country that was established when it pulled itself away from Spain, not that long before this. In the Netherlands, the rule for religion was religious tolerance. Christians of any denomination were welcome, and the separatist Puritans, hearing this, decided that this was the place for them. Because if they went over to the Netherlands, they could establish churches run any way they wanted, and therefore they wouldn't have to worry about any kind of outside interference. This seemed like a good idea. And so many of the separatist Puritans did that. In the very early part of the 1600s, just as it's becoming the 1600s, separatists left England and headed over across the English Channel to the Netherlands. They go to Amsterdam, and then they wound up in a place called Leiden, and settled in small communities where they could establish themselves and establish churches, run the way they wanted, with these kind of emphases that I talked about already. But the problem, among other things, that the separatist Puritans had when they arrived was that the Netherlands is very small. The reason why it's called the Netherlands is that a lot of it is under sea level. They always have to worry about floods. They've got these complicated sea walls and so forth. Um, and therefore, there isn't a lot of land available there for newcomers. So, in going over to the Netherlands, the separatist Puritans were accepting that they were going to lose some status. Many Puritans back in England were fairly middle class or even wealthy, um, educated, literates, all these things that were part of the emphasis of the Puritan ideas. And yet they're taking a step down when they came over to the Netherlands because these kind of jobs that they had and the kind of economic success that they would have had back home were not available, certainly not at first. They don't speak the language. Culturally, they're out on the outs. They're very small. Their likelihood of ever becoming as dominant or as successful as they had been back in England are going to be limited. But it was a trade off that they are willing to make because, after all, they get to pray the way they want to pray. And that seemed worth it to them. But that wasn't necessarily something that they could persuade the younger people in their families to also agree to. And this is one of the problems sometimes with an ultra Orthodox or ultra zealous religious community. If you have strong feelings that everyone else tells you are bad, that can make you rally the troops, that can make you circle the wagons, that can make you defend yourself, and that can make you feel more strongly about how right you are, and that can therefore build up and make defensible the ideas that you're fighting against everybody else for. But it's harder to get the next generation to buy in if things change. So, in a religious sense, the children of the separatist Puritans didn't have the experience of their neighbors telling them that they were bad or of running the threat of being arrested. They were raised in Puritan churches. They didn't have to fight for that, and therefore they didn't really have the same sense of identity as Puritans that their parents did. And as they got older, they hadn't made the same deal that their parents had made. Their parents had accepted that there was going to be a lack of status, or at least a reduced status. But as the younger people grew older, they are looking for a way of life. They're looking for land, they're looking for jobs, and many of them wound up leaving the Puritan communities that had been established and going elsewhere in the Netherlands looking for land, looking for jobs, looking for opportunity, and they might come back and visit or they might be gone forever. And the concern among the early Puritan leaders here was that this was going to lead over the next couple of generations to sort of a diffusion of their Puritan ideas because eventually all the kids and grandkids would leave and they would sort of spread out throughout the Netherlands and they would intermarry with the Dutch people and they might be a little more religious or differently religious than their Dutch neighbors, but the idea of there being Puritan communities would fall apart if there just weren't enough people in them. Um, and this concern was something that the Puritan leaders felt was going to be a deal breaker for them. Without being able to ensure that their religious ideas could continue into future generations. The idea being in the Netherlands, where they were a small group among a much more dominant cultural and non Puritan force, this was not going to work out for them. Now, as it happens, as the Puritan leaders, the separatist Puritan leaders in the Netherlands are facing this dilemma of the possibility of culturally fading away over the next, decades or whatever, they also began to realize that there was an alternative place where they could go, where they could worship the way they wanted, but didn't have to worry about cultural assimilation or future generations fading away. In other words, there was a place where they could go that was empty, a place where they could just sort of uproot their entire group again, but this time not have to worry about some of these cultural differences. And that was the New World. By the middle 16 teens, certainly the Puritans were very aware that the English had had, after some bumpy beginnings we talked about in the last class, that that the English had had some success in establishing colonies in the New World. Those colonies in and around Jamestown had, of course, struggled, and they don't look in many ways at all like the Puritan colonies. Religion's not something I mentioned at all in the last lecture. Um, but still, there is a world there, there is a possibility there. And as the Puritan leaders heard about what was going on over here in the New World, they became intrigued. Some of them read John Smith's book. He wrote a bestseller in 1614 that was read all over the English speaking world. Dozens of copies were sold. And one of the things he described was other places in the area that the English claimed as theirs, a little farther to the north, an area that on the map he called New England, which is roughly the northeastern coastal states today. He described it as cold and rugged, but also as having good prospects as a place for colonies. And the separatist Puritans, thinking this idea through, seeing what was going on with their children, worrying about the future possibility of their religion fading away, they decided that this was the place for them to go. Now, you'll recall that there had been these two companies that had been given the right to establish colonies in the New World by King James I. The first of them was based out of Plymouth. They tried to set up a colony in modern day Maine in 1607, and that collapsed. The other one of them, based out of London, established the Jamestown colony, which was successful, although the company really never made as much money as they wanted. So, in the late 16 teens, there is still the remnants of a company that has the rights to establish a colony farther to the north, the Plymouth Company, named after and based out of an important port city in England. The Plymouth Company did have the rights to colony making, to colony establishing in the northern part of the area that the English claim is theirs, where there aren't really any English colonies yet. And so key leaders of the separatist Puritans got in touch with the Plymouth Company and offered them a deal. How about we help you establish a successful colony in that part of North America that you have the right to establish colony in, but you haven't been able to get it going? Basically, as your first try failed, and then you just ran out of money. If you help set us up, if you help us with administrative tasks and help us getting a ship together and supplies and so forth, then our group of Puritans will go over to New England, farther up the coast, and we'll establish a colony. We'll work for you. You help us get there. We promise that we will work for you. We will send back things that the company, the Plymouth Company, can sell to other people in England or the rest of Europe to help make a profit. Essentially, what the separatist Puritans are agreeing to do is, as a group, they're agreeing to indenture themselves. The way indentured servants we talked about in the last lecture, the way individually they would indenture themselves to rich people, to rich farmers. In this case, the whole separatist Puritans as a group are basically agreeing that they'll indenture themselves as a group. If the Plymouth Company will help them get over there, then after that, they will work for the Plymouth Company for a period of years, 7 years, as is typical for an indenture. And then after that, they'd be on their own. And then they would be in a place where they would be free from outside interference. It seemed like a good deal to everybody. The Plymouth Company was excited about this because here's somebody, a group of people who seem determined and interested and willing to work. So, in 1620, most of the separatist Puritans left the Netherlands, went back to England, and then began the process of establishing a colony over here in the New World. The first main group of the separatist Puritans came across the Atlantic on a famous boat called the Mayflower in 1620. On board this boat, and it's not big. Most of these early boats are talking about 100, not much more than 100, maybe 120 people who are on board the boat. And conditions are bad as they go over, and you get seasick, and the food is terrible, and some people are dying of disease, and it's pretty miserable. But the Puritans who are on this boat, on the Mayflower in 1620, are convinced that all of the problems that they have had so far and all the problems on the journey that they're undergoing and all the problems that they may face when they get to the New World, all of those will be worth it because they felt they were on a religious mission. They were on a voyage to establish their ideal religious community. The separatist Puritans on the Mayflower refer to themselves and afterwards are traditionally referred to as the Pilgrims. A pilgrim is just anybody who's on a religious journey, anybody who's on their way to seek out or to find some kind of religion or strengthen their religion or what have you. This particular group of separatist Puritans, they refer to themselves as the Pilgrims. So the contract that they have with the company says the company is going to send people over in the Mayflower as well, and those people are going to run the colony. In fact, about half the people on the Mayflower are the Pilgrims, the separatist Puritans, and about half of the people on the Mayflower work for the Plymouth Company, who are going to be their bosses, and these people are going to actually manage the colony in the early days. The specific instructions are that they're supposed to land around modern day New York. This is before the Dutch had set up their colonies there, not long before they did. And it was known that this was going to be a pretty good location for a colony, so that's an ideal. The goal is they want to make sure that they establish the Plymouth Company wants a colony in an area that they thought would be easier to set up colonies in, but they're also trying to take a little chunk away from the Virginia Company's land to make sure that they sort of held on to. Remember that there was that dividing line that was a little bit murky. The Virginia Company had been successful, and this land probably should have been theirs. So the Mayflower came across the Atlantic Ocean, and in their journey, they didn't get to where they were supposed to go to right away. Instead, they made land up in New England, farther up the coast from where they're originally intending to go. They landed at the tip of Cape Cod, which is the arm-shaped, sort of looks like this, the arm-shaped peninsula that juts out from modern-day state of Massachusetts. Not surprising that this would be a place that you would land first because of how much it sticks out into the Atlantic. You can go to Massachusetts, go to Cape Cod, out at the very tip of the Cape, right out there's a town called Provincetown, and there's a monument, which is Pilgrim's Monument, and there's a celebration of the Puritans landing there in 1620. So the Mayflower arrived at the tip of Cape Cod in 1620, and they began to explore around to see where they were, but also to see what it looked like. And there was some discussion that maybe they should stay there. It's already pretty late in the year. It's getting pretty late if they want to grow any food. And winter is not that far away, and so they had to make some early decisions. But it was clear that Cape Cod, beautiful though someday it would be as a place to go on vacation, was not an ideal place for them to establish a colony. And the reason for that is that really the soil and the other living conditions are just not great. There's a reason why on Thanksgiving you have cranberry sauce or cranberries as part of the traditional Thanksgiving meal. We'll hear about the Thanksgiving and the Puritans in a second. But the thing is that nothing else really grows naturally on Cape Cod except cranberries. The soil is very acidic, and cranberries are just about the only thing that you can grow there that works for. So it's really just too sandy and otherwise too cold and too forbidding to establish as a colony as a place to live. So two alternatives are to work their way down the Cape and down the mainland of North America to the place that they're supposed to go. But the Cape, because of the way it bends, also creates a natural harbor. And inside that bend seemed like an alternative good place to go. And that, given that their time was pressing and it was getting on toward the cold months of the year, that was where the Mayflower went. It went around Cape Cod and went into the interior, the sheltered interior, and established a colony. They got off the boat and established a colony in the interior, a place that they landed that they called Plymouth, named after the place they'd sailed out of. Now, if you go to Plymouth, everybody makes a big deal out of Plymouth Rock, and there is a rock right there. But Plymouth Rock is not the place that the Pilgrims landed, simply because you don't land a boat on a rock. That doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. The rock is there, and so later on, it's sort of an easy place to point to. Here's where the Pilgrims landed, but actually, they kept the Mayflower out in the harbor, and on their little boats, they rode into the sand and got off. They're not stepping foot on a rock. That would be silly. But Plymouth is going to be the place where they're going to make their base of action and establish a colony, at which point, as they're unloading the Mayflower in the fall of 1620, the Puritans on board the boat realized that there was an important thing they had to talk about. That was this. They had a contract that said, go to New York, and when you get to New York, the representatives of the Plymouth Company will run the colony. Well, if they've all agreed that they're not going to New York and they've landed somewhere else and they're going to set up a new colony, well, then there's new rules. And realizing this, and a lot of the Puritans, they're smart. Some of them are lawyers. They realize that there's an opportunity here. The leaders of the Puritans on board the Mayflower quickly wrote up a new set of rules for this new colony that they're establishing from scratch. And that it's called the Mayflower Compact. A compact is an agreement, it's a contract. The Puritans, all aboard the Mayflower, quickly signed the Mayflower Compact, which said that in this new colony, not down in New York, but here in Plymouth, in this new colony, the Puritans would run the colony, not the representatives of the Plymouth Company who they're supposed to be working for. All the Puritans on board the boat signed this contract, and then they turned to the people who aren't Puritans and said, this is how we're going to run the colony. If you want to stick around, you should sign the contract too, and we'll all work together. But if you don't want to stick around, you can get back on the boat and go to New York, but we're here, and this is what's going to happen. Through coercion, because honestly, where else are those other people going to go? Many of the other non-Puritans on board the boat signed along, agreeing to what is sort of a coup, where the Puritans, the Separatists, the Pilgrims, whichever you want to call them, they have just taken over this new colony. The Mayflower Compact is sometimes described by historians as the first sign that colonists here would try to have some sort of self-determination, which isn't really what it's about. It's not really about the Pilgrims don't want to have the English tell them what to do. They're English. It's not that they don't want to have the king tell them what to do. They still believe that there's a king. They still believe that they're part of the British Empire. They still believe that the king ultimately is the main day-to-day authority over their laws and so forth. It's that they don't want someone with a different religion than them telling them what to do. So the Mayflower Compact is about these religious people on board the Mayflower seeing an opportunity and taking it as a chance for them to run the colony their own way with their own religion, which is the reason they went there in the first place. Now, they did follow through on the other parts of the original deal. For the first few years, the Separatist Puritans, as they established their Plymouth colony, they did ship things back to England that then the Plymouth Company could sell. Cape Cod has a lot of fish. Plymouth has a lot of fish. There's lumber. There are lots of furry animals that they can track down. They can do some trade with some of the local Native Americans to get some of these resources. And that stuff did get sent back, and so the Plymouth Company, in the end, did make some of the money that they'd been hoping to make. But from day one, as opposed to 7 years down the road, the Pilgrims, these Puritans, the Separatist Puritans, ran this colony themselves. Now, Plymouth was always a very small colony. There just weren't that many of the Separatist Puritans. They're not all on the Mayflower, but most of the rest of them came over once Plymouth got set up. But it was always a very, very small colony. And eventually, it will get taken over by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which I'll get to in a minute. Eventually, those merged because they're going to both be Puritan colonies established by sort of the different strands of the Puritans. But the key is that in establishing a Puritan-led colony in Plymouth, the Pilgrims, the Separatist Puritans in Plymouth, showed the rest of the Puritans that it was possible to set up a religious-based English colony in the New World. And so they set an important tone that's going to lead the rest of the Puritans to be interested in the possibilities here. Before I leave Plymouth aside, let's mention, which I've already alluded to, one of the other things that Plymouth is famous for, which is it gives us the Thanksgiving holiday that we celebrate from various traditions, but is a national holiday that we have to this day. And this is partly similar to the story that school children are often taught. I can remember when I was a kid, when I was in kindergarten, the teachers used to make us all dress up as pilgrims, and then we would have like a little feast the day before Thanksgiving, and then we'd go home and do the same thing with our families, except without the hats. Later on, school children got a little bit more politically correct, and kindergarten teachers have some of the kids dress up as pilgrims and some of them dress up as Native Americans. And, then it was supposed to all be about fellowship and good neighborliness and so forth. And, well, that's a step in the right direction and a little bit closer to what was really happening, but not the whole story. So, when the Pilgrims did first get off the Mayflower, once they had signed the Mayflower Compact and decided, yes, this is where we're going to be, and yes, we're in charge, it is late in the year of 1620. It's way too late for them to grow anything, and it's cold there. Conditions are really not great for growing things anyway. The local Native Americans could have responded very negatively to the arrival of these weird guys with their funny hats showing up in their land, but they were very friendly. Surprisingly so. Their numbers had dwindled somewhat. There had been a smallpox epidemic, as some of the earlier English explorers had accidentally brought the disease to that part of North America. And so the number of Native Americans was somewhat lower than it would have been otherwise. But still, the Native Americans were quite friendly in the early days and showed the Pilgrims some of the food that could be grown around there. Corn was one of the things, and helped them through that first very difficult year. Um, the Plymouth colony didn't have a lot of the starving time that had happened down in the Chesapeake because these people are really here, they're serious, but also they got some help. And they were successful enough in growing food that by the first anniversary of their arrival, after their first harvest, they knew that they were going to succeed and get through the first winter. And after that, they pretty much knew what they were doing. And so they did, approximately the anniversary of their arrival, they did have a big feast. The idea of a Thanksgiving is not unusual to the Puritans. It's a common thing in Christianity in those days where there would be a feast, a celebration, thanking God, thanking the Lord for something, frequently at a time of harvest. And so the Puritans did in Plymouth in 1621, the year after they had arrived, did invite the Native American neighbors to come with them and celebrate this as well. The stories and the pictures that school children learn is that it looks like the Puritans are inviting the Native Americans to thank them for the food and the support that they'd gotten to help them succeed as colonists. The reality is that Thanksgiving, as it was established, that first one, and really Thanksgivings for hundreds of years thereafter, in New England and eventually other parts of what will become the United States, they're not about thanking your neighbors or your friends or whatever, they're about thanking God. It's not that surprising that a place that was set up as a very Christian religious culture, that from almost day one that their focus is on God. Um, so Thanksgiving was a holiday and a celebration where they're thanking a supreme being for giving them a place where they could worship, a place that in their mind was empty and that they could then spread into and bring as many Protestants, bring as many Puritans as they wanted to, and eventually have larger and larger families and expand. And so they're kind of ignoring really the Native Americans in many, many ways, and then trampled over the Native Americans as Plymouth grew. Within a few years, the same tribes that had been invited to that first Thanksgiving, as Plymouth expanded and as those tribes began to object that the land that they had lived on, where they hunted and grew food and so forth, was being taken away by the Puritans, as the Native Americans began to object, both sides began to fight, and many of the same conflicts that had taken place in and around Jamestown, continuing all the way up to Bacon's Rebellion and beyond, those same kinds of conflicts took place in New England almost from the very beginning, culminating in New England with a bloody, terrible war from 1636 to 1638. The Puritans of Plymouth and the neighboring colonies had a bloody war against the Pequots and some of their Native American allies. Atrocities on both sides, hundreds, if not more, people killed in various engagements, and there's villages that are destroyed and so forth. When it's over in 1638, the Pequots were basically decimated, as were many of the Native Americans in New England, and especially the coastal parts of New England. and thereafter the Puritans were able to expand even further. Uh, but if you try to remember the next time you have a Thanksgiving ceremony or celebration with your family, uh, it wasn't really about fellowship or, hey, let's all be good neighbors, because from day one almost, the Puritans are arriving and not thinking about the Native Americans as neighbors. They're thinking about them as impediments. They're thinking about them as something to get out of the way. They're thinking about them as, nothing really more to consider the feelings of than you would consider the feelings of a rock or a horse or a squirrel. Part of the cultural preconceptions, unfortunately, that the Puritans bring with them as much as any other Europeans do. Okay, so back to England. The non separatist Puritans were curious to hear what was going on with their separatist buddies over here in Plymouth, but for many reasons, it seemed like they're still going to stick around. Um, in many ways, the early 1600s was a good time to be a Puritan, especially one of these less threatening, less aggressive, less radical Puritans in England. Specifically, the reign of King James I seemed like a good time for the majority of the Puritans, the ones who weren't quite so radical, to stick it out in England because it looked like they're on the right track. While James I was king, and he's king from 1603 to 1625, during that period, the Puritans seemed to feel that there was sort of a thawing and that they were getting closer to what they were looking for. This isn't to say James I was a Puritan. He was not. He is an Anglican. Um, and really, the people that he hates are the Catholics, which is, as far as the Puritans are concerned, is the right people to hate because they hate the Catholics as well. So while James I was king, he went after the remaining Catholics in the country and tried to crush them and repress them. He did impose. He did put as the Archbishop of Canterbury, the religious leader of the Anglican Church, a guy who had some religious ideas that were somewhat similar to the Puritan ideas. And the Puritans are beginning in some congregations in England to expand and to develop their ideas and this theory that they had that they would slowly be able to take over the faith congregation by congregation. It looked to them like this was going to work. The other thing is that the Puritans who stuck it out in England, the Puritans for the first quarter century of the 1600s also are doing well in other ways. A lot of the Puritans are doing well economically. They tend to come from the more educated, more elite groups of people, bankers and merchants and lawyers and so forth, who are doing pretty well. But also they're having some success in politics. I have some things to say about the political structure of England a little bit later, but the elected officials in England, the people who rule the country below or next to or with the king, is Parliament. And in the elected officials in Parliament in the early 1600s, the Puritans had been doing pretty well in getting some of their Puritans elected to Parliament, which meant that although they're never a majority, they did have an influential voice, and they're having some success in getting some laws passed that they felt would also make their lives easier and make their overall goals successful. So things look pretty good for the Puritans during the reign of King James the First, and therefore, as they see what's going on with the separatist Puritans, some of them are thinking, well, that's all well and good. You guys go do that, but we're going to stick it out here in England, and in the long run, we're going to be fine. But then James the First died. And the new king, King Charles I, is a very, very different kind of a guy. He's not actually so anti Catholic. In fact, he seems to have some kind of Catholic seeming ideas. Um, he really, really hates the Puritans. Just the Puritans and he do not get along. And partly that has to do with religious ideas. Now, I'm going to say that what's going to happen here is stuff that if you have never in any way encountered some of the Christian theology may be difficult to understand. And even if you have, even if you've been raised Christian, you may not really have thought about some of these parts, but we'll give it a try. So, one of the fundamental understandings of the relationship between God and humans that the Protestants in the main part of Europe and the Puritan Protestants in England came up with is an idea called predestination. It starts from these basic precepts. Christians believe in a God who is eternal, all knowing, and all powerful. And on the fundamental question that people have, what's going to happen to me when I die? Christians believe that either you go to heaven or you go to hell. If you go to hell, it's because of the punishment that's supposed to happen for your sins. And frankly, they believe that just about everybody deserves that. Heaven is reserved for a small elite, people who are sin free, or at least that they're chosen by God. Now, as far as especially people who follow John Calvin, that key Protestant leader in the mainland of Europe, and as far as all the Puritans were concerned, what was going to happen to you was something you had no control over. Because God, who has been around forever and will be around forever, God, who knows everything and always will know everything, knows already what's going to happen, knew what was going to happen before even we had this conversation, knew that the coronavirus was going to happen, knows who's going to win the election of 2020, knows when the world is going to end, knows it all, and in fact controls it all. And there is nothing that any minuscule, puny little person here in the world can do to change that. If you think you're trying to change your life, if you think you're trying to be a better person, if you think you're trying to be somebody who is going to get into heaven, that's not because you are acting that way or because you're trying to do that, but because God, who controls everything, God is making that happen. That's the theory. Protestants who support John Calvin, Puritans in England believe in this theory called predestination. Everything is destined in advance. It's been set down, not written necessarily, but it is in the mind of God already and has been forever. Nothing anybody can do about it. But it turns out that there's alternate points of view within the Protestant faiths, and there's an alternative point of view called Arminianism. Arminianism, which is named after another religious leader in the mainland of Europe, Arminianism is a belief that God gave humans free will, that God gave people a choice, the ability to determine to some extent their fate. And therefore, you can try to be better. You can try to be a better person, and you can act in a way that will ultimately swing the balance of whether after you're dead you go to heaven, you go to hell, whether God likes you or doesn't like you, whatever it may be. Puritans believe in predestination. They're convinced that that's the only explanation for the way the world works. It turns out that Charles I believes in Arminianism. He doesn't know the word. He's never heard the word before. It's just what he believes. And as the Puritans see that there's a guy in the most important job in England who believes something that they are 100% convinced is not just wrong, but is evil because it is so wrong. They take their religious ideas very seriously. It's not today where most of the time, if you're standing next to somebody at the bus stop and they say, yeah, I believe this, and you don't believe the same thing, you're not going to punch them. You're not going to push them in front of the next car. And you're certainly not going to think, well, you're going to hell. Or maybe you do, but probably most people don't. But the Puritans are convinced that anyone who disagrees with them on fundamental principles is evil. And it's not just any old guy. In this case, it's the king who's going to run the church that they're trying to reform, the king who is going to appoint the bishops and the leaders who then run the church on a day to day basis. That guy believes something so fundamentally different from them, so fundamentally wrong, so fundamentally evil as far as they're concerned. The Puritans can't have this. This is not the way that England is supposed to be run. And then there's this thing about Parliament, because Parliament was where the Puritans had been putting a lot of their emphasis, trying to get laws passed, trying to get people elected who would be supportive of them, trying to get Puritans into Parliament. Well, the king and Parliament had a big problem while Charles I was the king. Centuries earlier, there had been, after years and years, decades and decades of controversy, there had been an agreement between the king back in the 1200s and Parliament where power in the country would be shared. The king would have some power, Parliament would have some power, and the key distinction here is that the king doesn't run the whole country. Parliament gets to do some things, and specifically, Parliament is in charge of taxes. So, the king may want to do stuff, fight a war, build a castle, you name it. Um, but if the king doesn't have the money for it, the king has to ask Parliament to raise the taxes to pay for whatever that may be. This is part of the push pull that's supposed to be going on to make England work. Well, you got King Charles I, who has a very different view of the way the world is supposed to work. As far as Charles I is concerned, he knows that he's the most important person in England. He's the king. He also knows that he is the person that God loves more than anyone else in England. He's the king. As far as Charles I is concerned, it was pretty clear that God loved him more than anyone else in the country, because why else would God let him be king? And therefore, Charles really didn't like this deal that all the kings were supposed to follow, where Parliament makes some of the laws, where Parliament passes the taxes, where he has to negotiate with Parliament. He didn't like that at all. It bothered him a lot. He's got big plans, big projects, things he's got to do, castles he's got to build, who knows what. And so he got in touch with Parliament early in his reign, and he requested that they raise taxes for a particular purpose. And they discussed it and they debated it, and they came back to him and they said, yeah, we voted no. And that bothered him a lot because he wants these taxes raised. But he does have a loophole, which is that it's up to the king to decide when there'll be elections to determine who's in Parliament. So he sent that Parliament home. He said, okay, you guys are done. He called for new elections, and he's hoping that the next group of people elected to Parliament, maybe there'll be people he can talk to. Maybe there'll be people who, he can negotiate with a little bit better. So second Parliament came in, and after they got settled in, then he asked them to raise taxes as well. And they discussed it, they voted on it, and they said no. They said, yeah, we're not raising taxes. It's not happening. So you can see where this might be going. King got really upset at them. He sent them home, and he called for another set of elections. Each time, in addition to not getting what he wants, he's also getting, just by the way the votes work, he's getting a parliament that has more and more Puritans in it who are not going to listen to him anyway because of their religious problems. Plus, they don't really like being pushed around by the king. So the third parliament came in, and they barely even had time to do anything. They just sort of they sat around, they looked at each other and said, yeah, whatever this guy asked us for, we're going to say no. They let him know that they weren't going to raise taxes anytime soon. And so the king, at this point furious, sent that parliament home, but this time he refused to call elections. This series of stages took place over a number of years and eventually is going to lead to a civil war, and it's not going to work out that well for Charles. His reign is going to be one of chaos, instability, and eventually a civil war. And in the end, he gets his head cut off, so maybe God didn't like him more than anybody else after all, so maybe he was wrong about that. That controversy, which took place over a period of time, and that instability, which took place over a period of time, is going to lead many of the Puritans in England to start to wonder if maybe England is not the best place for them after all. Maybe the non-separatist strategy of staying within England, staying within the Anglican Church, trying to reform it from within, and slowly bring about the religious changes that they felt were the right way to pray, maybe that wasn't the best strategy. Some of them are going to stay behind, and a lot of them will wind up fighting against the king, and the king's going to get his head chopped off. And in the long run, the Puritans that stayed behind are going to have their moment. But others of them, others in the non-separatist majority, as things got bad between the king and Parliament, between the Puritans and the king, as stuff got bad, they start thinking, well, maybe the Pilgrims had it right after all. So, starting in 1628, a bunch of important Puritan business people worked out a deal with another company that had the right to establish colonies in the New World. Not far, this company has the rights to an area not far from where Plymouth was set up a few years earlier. And they worked out a deal where they'd be allowed to set up their own colony in the other part of Massachusetts, within the Massachusetts Bay. And they established in 1629, starting at Boston, which is still the most important city really in all of New England, but definitely the most important city in Massachusetts, they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this colony is much bigger from the beginning. Um, Several hundred people show up on the first ship that arrived in Boston in 1629. Hundreds are going to follow. They're going to have over 1,000 people within a few years. They did have some starving time problems, but there are just so many more Puritans of the non separatist variety who are willing to come over here and give this a try that their colony not only thrived pretty early and branched out from Boston to other parts of the Massachusetts Bay. They were a success and eventually grew to the point where decades down the road, they basically swallowed Plymouth up and it became way down the road, became part of their colony. Now, the leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony is an important lawyer, a Puritan lawyer in England, who came over pretty early in the show, a guy named John Winthrop. Winthrop arrived in 1631 and upon his arrival gave an important speech which laid out his goals for the colony. This speech, which has a really long, complicated name that you don't really need to know for my purposes, the textbook will tell you the full name. The speech is well known for one important image that he talked about. As he looks over the colony and as he talks about his goal for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Winthrop says that he wants the Massachusetts Bay Colony to be what he calls a shining city on a hill. Now, he doesn't mean that literally it's going to be on a hill, although Boston does have hills. But that's not what he means literally, because he's thinking figuratively. What he wants the Massachusetts Bay Colony to be is the ideal Christian community. He believes that God has given them the unique opportunity to start from scratch and to create the best, perfect, ideal Christian community, one where they can show the rest of Christianity, the rest of the world, the best way to run a colony, the best way to run a culture. As far as he was concerned, God had given them an empty place, a wilderness into which they could expand, in which they could try this experiment in an ideal Christian society and show the rest of the world how it would be done. You'll notice that in this speech, he is ignoring the Native Americans, as these Puritans like to do. As far as he was concerned, the Native Americans are essentially part of the landscape, and they'll be pushed out of the way the same way one might cut down a tree to start a farm. You're also going to cut down or get rid of the Native Americans if they get in the way of this ideal Christian experience. Now, also, you can get a sense of just how difficult and how much of a challenge this is going to be. Because if they're going to set up the ideal Christian community, the most godly place in the world, they better get it right. Right? They can't just sort of figure out this and nibble around with that and okay, let's experiment with this or whatever. They believe that they have been given this challenge by God to establish a place that will be better than everywhere else, that everywhere else would look up to them, the way one looks up to something on top of a hill from miles around. If you're walking on the street and there's something over there, you look up at it. Well, you're everywhere else in the world, as far as Winthrop was concerned, would look up at the Massachusetts Bay Colony and then try to follow their example. So they better get it right. The city on a hill idea, this image, becomes a fundamental idea of the identity first of the Puritans and eventually of Americans. There is something in the national discussion that even to this day, Americans think of themselves as separate, as idealized, as better than other cultures or other countries. And it dates back to these colonial founding where the Puritans, at least in their colonies, thought that they had been given this responsibility and this opportunity to create an ideal community, and they thought that they followed through on it successfully, and that they were an example, and that their mission was to show the rest of the world how to be the ideal Christian community. Well, the Christian part of it sometimes falls away, but in later generations, Americans did take this idea of being separate and better than everybody else very seriously in ways that the rest of the world often looks at the US and says, well, guys, come on. After the American Revolution, the United States is going to see that its mission is they've established the ideal form of government, which is a republic, and then they're going to try to spread that to the rest of the world, whether that's spreading republicanism or spreading democracy. In theory, the terms are interchangeable. They're not exactly, but we'll talk more about that later. Later on, jumping way, way ahead, but while we're on the subject, in the 20th century, when the U.S. became a major part of the world diplomatically and economically, the U.S. got involved in multiple wars, all predicated on this same sense that the United States had some sort of divine mission. Whether it was World War One, where President Woodrow Wilson announced that the U.S. was going to make sure that it was a war to end all wars, which didn't really work out that well because then there was World War II, where the U.S. felt it had the responsibility to stop the spread of Nazi ideology and the fascist ideas of the Germans and the Italians and their Japanese allies. And then after that, the Cold War, the multi-decade long standoff between the Americans and their allies and the Soviets and their allies, where the U.S. felt that it was on a mission to stop the spread of communism, all the way up to modern times where our leadership often talks about American exceptionalism, implies that the U.S. is a world leader, that the rest of the world should follow us or look up to us or get out of the way, depending on which particular leadership group you're talking about. All of that has ramifications for how we get along with the rest of the world. All of that has ramifications for the way Americans at least use the power that they have. And all of that dates back to these early colonial days, the early founding in the early 1630s with these Puritans just getting started, just trying to get started on this religious colony that they felt was a responsibility given to them by God. So, with that important responsibility they felt they had, let's try to figure out how it's going to work. Because, of course, they want to make sure they get it right. Winthrop is basically going to set the tone as the first governor of the colony, and he will govern the colony through its first decade or so, through many of the early challenges of getting started, and also many of the first internal problems that they're going to have in managing their colony. Under Winthrop, although they consider themselves part of the Church of England, they did have the opportunity to establish the kinds of churches that they had always wanted to have. And the fundamental religious principle of the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony is something called congregationalism. Under this theory, each congregation, which is to say the community that goes to each church, roughly that's each town, because each of these small Puritan towns will have their own church at the center of the town. So Lexington and Essex and so forth, each of these particular communities, each congregation would govern themselves. Be no outside influence, no one telling them who their minister could be, when they would build a new church, what they would pray on Sunday, what they would study in the Bible. All of that would be decided within the congregation. Any kind of outside interference goes against the fundamental principles of the Congregationalist ideal and of the Congregationalist kinds of churches the Puritans would establish. Now, if they're going to determine this themselves, then the key question is who gets to decide? Because Winthrop believed that everyone in each of these communities needed to go to that church. The Congregationalist churches that they're establishing, one of the first rules laid down was that everyone had to go. Everyone had to pay taxes to support that church because it is a religious community, a religious society, and that's the law. But not everyone is equal within each of these congregations. There is an elite, there is an elect group who are going to be the ones who are going to make the decisions for that congregation. And these are people who are referred to as the saints. In the Bible, the saints are the people who were the early apostles who then afterwards, Jesus' helpers, who then go off to heaven. Or in the stories of the church, they are the people who helped lead it to growth or had other important stories or things that came to them that made them key leaders in the development of the church and the development of the faith. The idea of a saint in Christianity is it is someone who has been inspired by God, who has been touched by God, who has been shown by God, and who will then lead other people in the direction that God wants them to go. According to the Puritans, there were still saints among them, people who were inspired by God, who were going to lead everyone else. The saints are the people who will make the decisions for everyone else. Saints get to decide who the ministers are. Saints get to decide what they're going to do with the money that they raise within the church. Saints get to decide if the community is getting big and there's more people than they really can fit into church or that can fit into their town. Are they going to divide into two towns or divide into two communities? The saints get to decide on some things about how they're going to do their weekly service and so forth. All the key decisions in running their community and their day-to-day of the church, those will all be decided by the saint. The saints choose the ministers, and the ministers will run the service on Sunday, and they'll give the sermons and so forth. But the saints are the true leaders of the community. Now, male and female saints did exist. Men who were saints had more responsibility, but female saints also were considered to be above everybody else and did have some election authority over some smaller decisions. They don't get to vote on things like who the ministers are or money things. But still, you could be a female saint and have this responsibility. Only saints were allowed to receive communion or to have their children baptized, which is crucial in the propagation of the faith in future generations. And, this is important here, only saints could vote for everything else. There's a religious test on politics. Unlike today, where basically it's just a question of citizenship and age. Once you're 18, if you're an American citizen, you can register to vote and you can vote in elections. In the Puritan communities established in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in those Congregationalist communities, only the saints can vote in the local elections, where the elections determine who's going to run the colony. Therefore, you want to be a saint. Everybody wants to be a saint. But the Puritans are focusing on some of the same beliefs that led them to believe in predestination, which is that their reading of the Bible, as far as they're concerned, shows them that most people are not saints. Most people are bad. Most people are sinners. Going back in the early days of the Bible to the story of Adam and Eve, as far as they're concerned, everyone has sin, and therefore everyone, when you get down to it, is a bad person. And God is only going to choose a select few people who maybe sin a little bit less or maybe a little bit better than everybody else. But even them are pretty miserable, and they should just thank their lucky stars. So here's how it works. In each of these early communities, as they established their Congregationalist churches, first in Boston and the other communities that went out from there, they have to determine who the first leaders, the first saints are going to be, and then those saints get to vote on anybody else who wants to be a saint. So the ministers, obviously, some of the early leaders like Winthrop, the big community leaders, it was clear that they were going to be the saints because they had inspired all the other Puritans to come to this area. The Puritans are also pretty sure that they could tell who the saints were based on status. So the leaders, the elites, the people who had money or better education or higher status positions in the community, they were also chosen as the early saints in each of these communities. Because the theory was, well, these clearly are people that God loves more than everybody else. And God would not want to punish people that God likes, and therefore God is going to make sure that the people who he wants eventually to have with him in heaven, these people are going to have an easier life. They're going to have the bigger houses. They're going to have the higher status positions. They are the ones who are going to pray harder and lead others and so forth. And so those people they would choose as saints, but then other people could become saints after they'd chosen the first group of leaders, because you could apply to be a saint. It's not quite like applying for a job. Because when you apply for a job, if you don't get the job, the only person who knows about it is you and the person who didn't hire you. You apply to be a saint, then everybody knows, which is why this is pretty tough. Here's the way it works. After the church was going in your community, and after you'd chosen the first group of saints, and they've chosen a minister, and they're doing the weekly services, and they've got the Bible study going on, and so forth, All that's happening. And then you, as a regular parishioner, somebody who is a Puritan, somebody who has supported the church, goes every Sunday, their tax money pays for the church just like everybody else, but you feel that you are somehow different from, separated from everyone else, that God loves you more than anyone else, then you, on a particular Sunday, when you're feeling quite sure, you step forward. After the church service is over and everybody is sort of getting ready to go, then at that point you raise your hand and you say, listen, I wonder if I could have everybody's attention. And then you step forward and you talk to the community. And keep in mind, these are small communities. These are small neighborhoods. These towns are tiny. They're just enough people that will fill up a small Puritan church. So they're your neighbors. They're your friends. They're your relatives. They're people who know you intimately, who in some cases have known you for years, who people who see you day to day and know just about everything about your life. You're going to speak to them. And you're going to stand forth before them and you're going to say, I believe that I should be considered one of the saints. And here's why. And then you have to tell your story. And it's not just a simple reading of the resume. It's not just a simple, well, here's some of the nice things that I have done. Because the Puritans don't believe that kind of thing. The Puritans believe that religion is a struggle. The Puritans believe that everyone is sinful, dating back to Adam and Eve and the original sin. They think that everybody is being pulled toward sin and pulled toward hell, and that therefore every day in every moment is difficult and hard, and most of the time you fail. Even Winthrop, and you can read one of the documents that I gave for this week, is John Winthrop's Christian Experience. This guy, if you read that document, he's one of the leaders of this whole religious experiment, and yet he hates himself and is convinced he's a hypocrite, that God never truly loves him the way he wants God to love him, and he knows he can never really measure up to the faith that he is trying to communicate. Even Winthrop feels that way. Everyone in the Puritan communities feels that way about themselves. And so that's what you have to tell your neighbors. That's what you have to tell your friends and your fellow congregants. The story you have to tell when you're applying to be included in this elite group is a story of your struggles, is a story of your failures, is a story of all your sins. You have to bare your soul and admit all of your mistakes, admit all of your flaws and all of your weaknesses and all the times that you felt temptation and couldn't stop yourself from doing something you knew you shouldn't do. Then, and only then, after you have laid out all the things that are wrong with you and all the things that are miserable about you, then you can reach some sort of a climax in your story when you feel that recently something has changed. I've been going to church and I've been trying to do things, and like that's been going on forever. But somehow recently something changed. And typically, in a lot of these stories, as Winthrop tells his story, it's often a time of physical problems, sickness, or some other time when one feels misery, when one feels that God just hates you, the way sick people do. You're lying in bed and you're like, oh, everybody hates me. Oh, I'm miserable. Oh, I just want to die. Um, and I shouldn't make fun of that because unfortunately millions of people are feeling that kind of existential fear right now and thousands are dying. Um, but that kind of misery and agony and feeling just sort of bereft in that moment, in that kind of a moment, then the Puritans standing before their fellow congregants, they would say, something changed for me. I felt somehow that God was looking down on me, that God was smiling on me, that my relationship with God was different. Not only did I get better, but also after that, my soul got better. I am a better person. I'm a changed person. And here's how. And then you have to lay out to everyone else, since this spiritual moment, this kind of light in the wilderness kind of a moment, here's what has changed for me, and then get real specific again. And after this is over, then the other congregants can ask questions. They can raise their hand. They can say, listen, you say that ever since a week ago Thursday, your relationship with God has gotten so much better and you're just not a sinner as much anymore. And yet you still haven't returned that $20 you owe me. And I'm pretty sure I saw you coveting your neighbor's wife the other day, and they can ask a lot of embarrassing questions. And, when it's all over, after you bared your soul and probably cried copious tears before your friends and your neighbors and your loved ones, people who are going to still see you the next day, then after it's all over, the saints can huddle up and they can vote no. They can say, yeah, we didn't buy it. You know, God doesn't really love you that much. You're not one of us. You're not a saint. At which point, what they're saying is, you're going to hell. Sorry. That's how that worked out. Didn't work out for you. We'll wave to you from heaven when you're down in hell. Sorry about that. Eternity is not going to be that fun for you. That's what they're saying. So you probably would only do this if you were pretty sure that they're going to vote yes. Most of the time they do vote yes. A lot of times it seems like there's been some discussion in advance, but they're only going to believe it. They're only going to accept it if indeed you have from the very beginning made clear why you don't deserve it, why you're miserable, why you're a horrible person. And that's the sort of story that the Puritans believe because that's what they think about themselves. And that's what they think about their neighbors. They're running the most pure religious community, and yet they think that they're all about temptation and sin and sinfulness and just being bad, which is sort of a weird way to run a religious community, but this is what they believe. So, not that many people wind up being saints because there aren't that many people that are going to be able to meet this high bar, and not that many people who are going to try. If you're kind of halfway, I'm not really sure, maybe they'll let me in, you're not going to go for it. And yet everyone has to support the Puritan churches, everyone has to support the saints. The saints will never be the leaders of the political leaders of the community because ministers are not allowed to be, but other saints can be. And so the Governor Winthrop and then a bunch of locally elected assistants are going to help him run the whole colony. They are religious saints; they're not ministers. It's not a theocracy where the religion runs the government, but in every other way, there's no separation of church and state. In fact, the local government in each of these communities is in the same town, it's in the same building as where they pray on Sunday. And there's a religious test for voting. So in other ways, church and state are intimately connected. So they have established these rules, these very difficult social and cultural rules about how religion is going to run their colony, and then they're going to try to live their lives. They're going to try to expand, and they're going to try to see if this experiment of creating this ideal religious society and what they think of as a wilderness, but actually has many other people living there already, is it going to work? And, well, it sort of does in some ways. But the problem is that, among other things, the Puritans are not set up particularly well to deal with anyone who might object, even in a small way, to how they've set up their rules. Because if they think that they have been given the responsibility by God to establish an ideal religious society, then anyone who in any way raises a problem about anything they're doing is going to threaten maybe the whole thing. So when there are challengers who step forward, who say, yeah, maybe 95% of what you got is right, but this other 5% we need to talk about, then the Puritan response to any kind of challenge to the hegemony of the way they're thinking is not going to be, well, let's talk about that. It's going to be, yeah, we're going to arrest you and maybe kill you. So let's do some test cases and see how the Puritans do when somebody raises objections. Here's a hint, not that well. Okay. The first significant challenge to Puritan hegemony, to the Puritan authority and the rules set down by Winthrop and the other leaders of this Massachusetts Bay Colony, is a young guy named Roger Williams. And there's a lot of fairly boring names in the early days here, but they're not boring people. Roger Williams arrived in 1631. He's a pretty young man, young single man at first. Is well educated, and early on he was offered the job to be a school teacher in one of these early Puritan towns in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He turned down the job, and the reason why he turned down the job will give you some idea of who he is and why he is going to lead to controversy. So as far as Roger Williams was concerned, the way they had decided to establish their schools in the early days of these Puritan settlements to him was dangerous, because in each of these little communities, education is important, and they're going to try to provide a church-based education to all the children, and they're having lots of kids, and so this is going to be a big need. But it bothered him that the schools include the children of saints and the children of non-saints. Now, they're children, but as far as Roger Williams was concerned, well, these kids here, because their parents are saints, they've been baptized, and probably when they get older, they're going to get to be saints too. These kids here, their parents are not saints. They have not been baptized. Um, Probably their chances of ever being saints are not great. And yeah, they're all Puritans, and therefore they're pretty religious and they pray a lot and they take religion very seriously. But honestly, probably not saints, which means they're going to hell, which means they're evil, which means what are we doing letting evil children in the same classroom as the good children? There's no way that the good children are going to be able to keep their pure, good little souls if the evil children are around them all the time. And therefore, he said, if the plan for the schools is to have the saints and the non-saints kids mix without any kind of separation, I can't do it because I think it's bad for the good kids' souls and it's bad for my soul. He's a saint. Everybody accepts that. But he's convinced that there needs to be some kind of separation. The theory had been not only is it expensive to have multiple schools and multiple classrooms and so forth, but also mingling the children of the two different groups supposedly would help the children of the non-saints continue to buy in to the ideas and the culture and the authority of the churches as set up. And so that was why they did it. But as far as Roger Williams was concerned, too dangerous. Can't allow it. I can't take that job. And in fact, he is so segregationist in his ideas about religion that some of the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony said, well, maybe you should try Plymouth. You sound kind of like them. You're a little bit nuts, kind of like those guys are, a little more radical. So give Plymouth a try. And he did. After that first job didn't work out, he went over to Plymouth. Plymouth at this point had been around for over a decade. And he likes what he sees at first because these people are more radical and their ideas are a little bit more in line with this kind of separation that is his fundamental idea, except that he realizes after he's been in Plymouth for a little while that some of the people who've been living in Plymouth at various times had gone back to England, on business, or they had relatives back there that they'd visited, or maybe somebody died. And as he teases out this story, Roger Williams said to these Plymouth separatist pilgrims, these are the most radical of the radicals. Roger Williams said to them, so listen, when you go back to England, do you go to Puritan churches? I'm just wondering, like, what happens about that? Like, what's going on with the religion thing when you go back to England? And they say, well, we wish we could, but there really aren't any Puritan churches in some parts of England. So we do the best we can do. We try to find the most kind of Puritan-y place for us to worship, and then we do lots of Bible study on the side. And, we try to keep as close to the faith as we can. And then we come back here to the ideal religious society, and everything's great. And Roger Williams said, well, it's really not good enough. Because when you're going back to England, and we try to get away from England, like that's the whole point. Over there, they've got all these terrible religious ideas, and those churches there that aren't Puritan churches, I mean, all the junk that they're saying is clearly bad for you, and it's going to like rot your soul. And if you're going to churches that aren't Puritan churches, I'm sorry, but probably your souls have been destroyed. And everybody who went back to England, he tells everyone else in Plymouth, like, we should kick them all out. We should just get rid of them because we can't trust any of them. They're probably all going to hell, and we can't listen. They're probably poisoning the rest of us with their horrible ideas. And I mean, these are the pilgrims. These are the original pioneers in the idea of a Puritan community, and had the most narrow-minded, radical interpretation of what a Puritan faith should be. If he's trying to get rid of some of them, then clearly there's a problem here. And so the Plymouth thing didn't work out for him either. So he went back to the main part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, looking for something else to do. and he went to the town of Salem. Salem, later in the century, in the late 1600s, is going to be infamous for the witch trials, and it's worth parenthetically saying that witch trials were common throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern times, all throughout Europe, and then they're going to happen here in the colonies. There's going to be a lot of witch trials in the Puritan communities because they're so concerned about sin and because they're so convinced that the devil is going to try to get in and wreck their communities and wreck their ideal religious society. Witch trials are also a way of one gender basically trying to be dominant over the other, although male witches are sometimes attacked and so forth. For the most part, it's about women. The witch trials in Salem are sort of the apotheosis of this, and then afterwards, the witch trial phenomenon largely faded away, or did it? In many ways because the Puritan faith by the end of the 1600s is starting to change for reasons that I'll talk about later. But anyway, Salem will eventually have the biggest and most extreme of these witch trials, which maybe is an indication that in its early days it might be the kind of place where extreme ideas will fit in. And so maybe that's how it is that Roger Williams went there and found a fairly welcoming community for his more extreme vision of the Puritan faith. In fact, there's a job opening to be the assistant minister, which he got. Now, this doesn't mean he's running this particular town's church. Instead, he's the assistant to the minister and helping out. And it does mean that from time to time he gets to sort of stand up and say stuff because if the minister's sick or traveling to another community or whatever, then every now and then Roger Williams gets a chance to shine on a particular Sunday. And whenever he does, he always has stuff in his mind. And every time he gets a chance to speak forth, his ideas, in one sense, you could see where he's coming from, but they always challenge some fundamental rules about how they've set up their colony. So, early on a particular Sunday when the minister's not available, Roger Williams gave a sermon in which he led off with the statement that they had no right to be on this land that they're on right now. And so you might be thinking, oh, Roger Williams, good for you. You've remembered that this is Native American land and that you're usurping the land that has been for generations, for thousands of years, been the land of Native American tribes that, no, that's not at all what he's thinking. Instead, what Roger Williams is saying is, well, follow me here. We're on this land because the government of the colony gave us this town and the colony got this land from this company, and the company got this land from the king, and the king we already know is evil. And therefore, by, I don't know, like the transitive property of evil or the transmission, like electricity or something. Anyway, he's convinced that because it's predicated on a person and a phenomenon that he knows is unreligious, that therefore the whole chain thereafter is predicated on something that's not religious and therefore not good enough. But if he's right, then, where should they have a colony? Should they just give up and then go like to the middle of North America and find a place that no European monarch says that they control? Or should they go like to the poles or something? Or Mars? Or I don't know. Like, where is there going to be a place that there is not a previous authority that is going to be as close to his religious ideas as possible? There isn't one. So he's basically telling them we should just give up the colony and start over, and that's obviously not going to happen. And under John Winthrop, they've established what they think of as the ideal Christian community. And so, yeah, it's maybe not great that it's connected when you get back far enough to the king and all the corruption back in England, but that's why they came here, to get away from that. So, yeah, okay. This is an example of the kind of thing that Roger Williams is famous for. He's not a bad guy. He just asks questions. His questions are not designed to stir up trouble. He just can't help himself. He just asks stuff. And all the way up to John Winthrop, they like the guy. They respect his religious sentiments. They respect the fact that he is motivated by the trying to do good, but they just wish he would shut up. Well, later on, another time when the minister was out of town, Roger Williams objected to something fundamental in how the colony works on a day-to-day basis. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is expanding. And as it expands, sometimes that's because they're having lots of kids, but sometimes it expands because new people are coming in from England. And the rule is that when a new person comes to the colony, that person has to swear an oath. They have to promise that they will follow all the laws of the colony, including the fundamental laws about religion and about supporting the Puritan church, supporting these Congregationalist churches, and so forth. And so that is an important moment because you need to make sure that these new people are going to follow all the rules. So that oath, we don't really do oaths that much anymore. You know, if you watch Law and Order, people swear an oath that they're going to promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and then they lie like crazy. Um, but oaths are a big deal, and Christian communities take them very seriously in early modern times because someone is holding the Holy Bible and that other person is touching that Bible. Sort of the magic of the religion is right there in that moment, and they raise their hand toward God and they swear before God and before the community and before this person is holding the Bible before them that they will whatever they're swearing. In this case, that they'll follow the rules. Well, Roger Williams is worried about that moment because you have an outsider, you don't know anything about this person. Are they a saint? Are they not a saint? We'll find out eventually, but most of them aren't saints. You have that person swearing an oath, which is a very, very powerful moment, a religious moment. God's right there. You're holding the Bible, the holiest of the books, the words of God right there. And the person holding the Bible and administering the oath is one of the leaders of your community, in other words, a saint. Well, every time that happens, Roger Williams is a little worried that if the non-saint from the outside could be tainting the soul of the saint administering the oath. And so he says we should stop the oaths. We shouldn't have everybody promise before God that they're going to follow the rules because it's too dangerous for the saints in our community to keep doing that. But John Winthrop and the other leaders of the colony want there to be an oath because they want to make sure that everyone who fears God and fears God's vengeance, that they will promise before God to follow the rules of the colony. So what are we going to do instead? Okay, well, he's just asking questions. He's just raising a concern. Eventually, another time, he gets a chance to stand up before the Salem congregation, and Roger Williams says, you know, it's probably a bad idea that we're letting non-saints come to church at all. Hey, probably we should just not even let them in. Because, you know, what could be a more holy place than the church? And yet we've got these people, most of the people who we've decided aren't saints, or they're probably not going to be saints, and that means they're going to hell. And if they're going to hell, they're evil. And why should we have all these evil people in this holy place where they could corrupt the church and the other people here who aren't corrupt already? Like, why should we even let them in? Keep them out. And again, the leadership of the colony, well, what are we supposed to do? This is a Puritan colony. We're trying to show the rest of the world how to do it. And yes, not that many of us are going to be saints, but we're still way more religious than the rest of the world. And those non-saints may eventually come around. And we're hoping that if everyone is a part of the church and supports the church, well, then everyone is going to get to where we need to go, which is this ideal Christian society. And what would you have us do? Well, again, asking questions, causing trouble, rumbles of dissatisfaction with some of the things that he's saying because the leadership of the colony don't like the directions that he's going. And then the minister died. And the people of Salem who thought that Roger Williams was cool, they made him the minister. He's not the assistant minister, he's the minister, which means that every Sunday he can say some other thing that is going to make the people in Salem say, interesting, that's cool. And everyone else in Boston and the rest of the Massachusetts Bay Colony say, oh my God, what did he just say now? So this is a dangerous moment for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where Roger Williams can just say whatever he wants, and there's no ramifications for that, and who knows what sort of other things he's going to say. Well, around the same time that Roger Williams became the minister and therefore the religious leader of the Salem community, the town of Salem realized that they were bumping up against their borders. They had been given the right to establish a community in the early days of the settlement of the colony by the leadership of the colony. Governor Winthrop and the rest of his assistants had drawn lines on the map and said, okay, you get to be a town. So Salem is running out of space, and they need more space. Representatives from Salem went to Boston to directly petition the governor for the right to expand. We want to draw the lines differently. We want to add more land to our town so we can have some more farms and we can add more people and all that kind of thing. And the governor looked these people from Salem in the eye and he said, listen, I'd be happy to let Salem expand. You can have more land if you want. On one condition, you got to fire Roger Williams. He can't be your minister anymore because he's driving me crazy. The things he's saying are too dangerous for the long-term health of our colony. And the people from Salem, to their credit, said, fire Roger Williams. We love Roger Williams. He's a great guy. There's no way we can no deal. And they went back to Salem, and they're all very huffy about it. I can't believe that Governor Winthrop would try to do this. How can he try to get rid of Roger Williams? We think he's the greatest guy since sliced bread, which they don't have yet. But anyway, and they get back to Salem, and they tell Minister Roger Williams this whole story, and they tell all their neighbors, and everyone in Salem is up in arms about this. How could the governor do this? And Roger Williams, the next Sunday, when he has a chance to address the whole town, stands up before the congregation, he tells the whole story, and he applauds the people who have gone to Boston and come back with this story. Good for you guys. Thank you for standing up for me. I can't believe that the governor would be so appalling as to try to get rid of me. And they all cheer, good for you, Roger Williams, yay, Salem. Then he thinks about it some more. And he's like, well, the thing is that based on the fundamental principles of Congregationalism, no outside interference, which means that Governor Winthrop has just broken the cardinal rule of the church that he established, which means we can't trust that guy, which means that the guy who we thought was the saint of all saints, he's not a saint. In fact, I don't think we can trust anybody outside of Salem because everyone else, they think John Winthrop is the cat's meow. But we here in Salem have been tested, and we have been found true because we stood up against the irreligious, evil John Winthrop. Winthrop set up the colony. Winthrop established Congregationalism. Winthrop established all the rules, including the rules about who the saints are. This is asking a lot. This is asking the people of Salem to renounce the governor, to renounce the whole government, to renounce basically everybody outside of their community. While they're thinking that over, Roger Williams comes back with this. Okay, we've established that Governor Winthrop is a sinner and he's evil and he's going to hell. We've established that all the people he works with are evil, sinners, going to hell. Well, you people from Salem who went and met with him, you have been in the presence of evil, and your souls have probably been tainted as well. And therefore, for safety's sake, we should get rid of those people who went to Boston also. And the people of Salem say, well, those people stood up for you. What now? Yeah, if they were tested, they were shown that they're not sinners, that they're not evil. And Roger Williams has this very narrow interpretation of how one can keep one's soul pure. And he says, yeah, I can't do this job anymore if you're going to let those people stay in the town. And for the people of Salem, even this finally is just too much. And so the leaders of Salem got in touch with Governor Winthrop and said, yeah, we'll take your deal. Roger Williams was fired as the minister of the town of Salem. At that point, he's just regular Joe Blow Puritan. Salem got to expand its borders, and at that point, when Roger Williams was just a regular guy, then Governor Winthrop had Roger Williams arrested, and he's put on trial. He's tried with the crime of heresy, which is speaking out or in some way inciting anti religious sentiment. And in a religious community, this is a pretty big deal. If found guilty, he could be executed. Their intention is that they're going to banish him. They're planning on sending him back to England. I think that John Winthrop is sort of imagining Roger Williams goes back to England and just bothers people there with his irritating questions, and he's sort of liking that idea. But while Roger Williams was in jail, and early jails are not like jails of today, there's no cells, there's no bars, there's barely even a place. A lot of times, the jail is just somebody's house, and you have to check in from time to time to make sure that you're not doing stuff you're not supposed to. Well, so while Roger Williams was in jail awaiting his final fate, he and a bunch of his friends just basically snuck him out of there. They left the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They head a little bit farther down the coast. Roger Williams and his allies, the people who like him really and the ideas he stands for, they eventually, a little bit farther into New England, they establish a new colony. They call the settlement that they established in 1635, they call it Providence. Providence means a gift from God, basically. And eventually, that small community established by Roger Williams grew into the not very big, but eventually grows into the larger colony of Rhode Island, led by Roger Williams, who is going to be the leader and eventually governor of the Providence colony that grows into the Rhode Island colony. This is the first of many ways in which the Puritans are going to break into little pieces. They don't always get along, and the best solution that Roger Williams shows is sometimes when you don't like the group in charge, then go somewhere else and set up your own version with your own rules. And Roger Williams is the first one to do this. Now, Roger Williams, as the boss of his own colony, has, of course, been tested and does a complete 180. In his new colony, where he's in charge, Roger Williams decides that he doesn't need to have the same strictness that he had been trying to propose in Massachusetts Bay. And I think the thinking here is, well, I was tested by all this controversy, and I know my soul is fine. And so, therefore, probably my theories about how easily bad things can maybe spread from a good person to a bad person or a bad person to a good person, maybe I don't have to worry about that as much. But also, I think that when you're setting up your own colony and you're the boss, you have to be more flexible than when you're a critic. So, in Providence and in the Rhode Island colony that grows out of it, Roger Williams says that he will allow any kind of Christianity, as long as you're not Catholic, because I mean, come on, they hate the Catholics. But he opens up a certain amount of religious tolerance in the Rhode Island colony. He has a Puritan church. He's the minister and the boss of it. But there are other parts of the colony where he allows other kinds, other branches or strands of Puritanism. And some people aren't even Puritans are allowed to set up their churches in his colony. And he also begins to have more of a different interpretation of a separation between the church and the state, not based on the modern idea that church shouldn't get into religion, but more it's that religion and church are two things that need to be separated because one will poison the other. But anyway, Roger Williams left in 1635 after 4 years of controversy, 4 years that tested the Massachusetts Bay Colony and their ideas. And I have to say, if they're a test case, they don't show that Massachusetts Bay can deal very well with someone who's raising what are really kind of innocent questions. You know, Roger Williams is never saying, I think we should just tear the whole thing down. He's certainly not saying, I think that religion is bad or that the Puritans are bad or that the colony should, worship the devil or something like that. Instead, he's just saying, why are we doing it this way? And he's kind of fussing around at the edges. And in the process, John Winthrop basically cheated and broke one of the fundamental rules. So if that's how they deal with the controversy, I mean, what if it's a bigger controversy? What if it's a more fundamental question that's being raised? Or here's one. What if the person raising the questions isn't a guy? Well, the next big controversy is going to be a test for all of those questions because the next big controversy revolves around a woman named Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson like Roger Williams, had come to the Massachusetts Bay Colony very early. She'd arrived in the early 1630s, and she and her husband settled down. They are saints. Everyone knows they're accepted as saints from the very early going, and therefore important leaders in their community. Anne Hutchinson, in addition to being a mother and a wife, also had an independent living of her own. She was a midwife, which is one of the reasons why historians believe that she eventually fell afoul of some of the men around her, because midwifery, the process by which women help other women have children, is involves scary, spooky things that men don't understand and are a little bit scared of. And so some of the things that are said about her later may have been partially predicated on the fact that she had this independence as well as was involved in childbirth, which men are completely scared of in those days, maybe still. So, Anne Hutchinson and her husband are saints. Everyone knows that. And as I said, the Puritans take very strongly believe very strongly in the idea of Bible study. They believe that not only is it important to go support the church every Sunday and in every other possible way, economically and so forth, but that it's incumbent upon every individual Christian to study the Bible, to understand the words of God that come through in the Bible, whether the Old Testament or the New Testament, that these are the way that everybody is supposed to try to figure out how to live their lives the right way. And the Hutchinsons began to host a regular Bible study session in their home that quickly was dominated by Anne Hutchinson. Her husband is there, but he is really the minor partner in the story. Anne Hutchinson is the leading light in their community. She's the leading Christian in their community, and she's a fascinating, powerful intellect who has lots of understanding of the Bible and Christianity and the Puritan faith, but has some slightly different interpretations. Specifically, Anne Hutchinson began to throw out some ideas and some questions based on her reading of the Bible that ran somewhat askew from some of the ways that they had established their colony in the early days. So, Anne Hutchinson began to raise some questions about how they chose the saints. She knows she's a saint. She knows her husband's a saint. She's pretty sure the minister in her town, who's the guy she followed from England over to the colonies, that he's a saint. But a lot of the early saints, and continuing through the early days of the colony, sainthood seemed largely to be based on status. As I said, they assumed in the Puritan colonies that they could tell who the saints were based on status. As far as they were concerned, God clearly likes the saints better than the non saints, and therefore God is going to provide us with a clue. People who are wealthier, people who have a higher status, they're going to be the saints. And the people who are poor, sorry, you're not going to be. God just doesn't like you that much. Why would God let you be poor if God didn't like you? If God, that doesn't make any sense. So, therefore, there was in the sainthood process, there is a real elite representation among the saints, and everybody else, the poorer people, the more working class people, they're on the outs, kind of looking in. Well, Anne Hutchinson says, based on my reading of the Bible, this doesn't really make sense. Why would there be clues? Why would we assume God would give us clues? Why would we believe that we would be able to interpret what God is thinking? God is all powerful and eternal and all knowing, and we are compared to God as nothing. And so for us to have the effrontery to believe that we could imagine what God is thinking, or to think that we are picking up on something that God is trying to tell us when we are just miserable little specks. No. There's no way that we could possibly understand what God is thinking. And this belief that God has chosen the elites as the saints because God likes them better, I mean, that doesn't make any sense, because their time here on earth is tiny. If you're lucky, you make it to 60 or 70, and a lot of Puritans make it to 40 or 50. And then after that, you're dead. And death is forever. That's eternity. Our time here on earth is not even a fraction of the amount of time that eternity represents. So how should we think that we can judge our fate based on this tiny little speck of time? when all of eternity is what's going to be happening when our souls are in heaven or hell for the rest of eternity. In fact, if you think about it, maybe God's thrown a bone at the rich people. Maybe those people are going to hell, and God is letting them have a little bit of good times now so that when they're in hell later, they can look back on the good old days and make hell a little bit easier. Maybe the poor people are the ones who are really going to heaven because God's kind of softened them up, and then later on they'll enjoy heaven a little bit more because things were pretty bad, but it got better. Who knows? And that's the key. Ann Hutchinson says there aren't any clues. There's no way you can tell just by looking at somebody or the way that they live whether God likes them or not. Ultimately, this challenge to how they'd chosen the saints became known as antinomianism, which, when you break it down, basically means we can't tell on the face of it what someone's soul's fate is. Status today here on earth has nothing to do with ultimate status and with sainthood. Well, she's raising that question, and it's a dangerous question because the implication is they may have chosen some of the wrong saints. The implication is that people who have been denied sainthood maybe have a chance to be saints, that the door is open to them, that they may indeed someday get to go to heaven, even if they're miserable now, or even if they're just regular run of the mill Puritans that no one thinks very highly of. The antinomianism idea was very popular with people who weren't saints, which were the majority of the people in her town and ultimately the majority of the people in the colony. And the antinomianism idea spread very quickly. But the leaders of the colony are very scared because it calls into question some of the fundamental ideas about who's actually in charge of their colony. And so, what she is proposing in her Bible study classes, this antinomianism idea, is very dangerous to the leadership of the colony. And they're scared to death. And then Ann Hutchinson came up with a new idea. She said, what if God could tell us directly who the saints are? As far as the Protestants are concerned, as far as the Puritans are concerned, and all the Protestants, and really all Christians, they believe that the time when God speaks directly to people is over. That's why you read the Bible. The Bible is about the times in the times of Moses and the ancient Israelites when God came down and spoke to those prophets, or the Bible is about the New Testament where God embodied as Jesus came and walked among us and spoke to people, and you put together the words and ideas of those two different times, and then you study those because those are the times when God directly spoke to people that we can learn from. But that time is done. That's why we have the Bible. We have to read the Bible and understand that. That's what Christians believed. But Ann Hutchinson says, well, we also believe that there is God within each one of us. And again, if you have no connection to Christianity, this part is going to sound complicated. You just have to take my word for it. This is what Christians believe. Christians believe that there is one God, but it is embodied in three ways. So God is God the Father, the creator of heaven and earth, the God who speaks directly to Moses and Noah and some of the other prophets in the Old Testament. That's God the Father, the creator. Then there is a second manifestation of God, a second incarnation of God, still God, but manifested in a different way. And that's the God of Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God, but still the same God, a different kind of iteration, a different manifestation of the same God. And then there's a third part of the Holy Trinity, as Christians believe in it, that God is sort of three parts of the same thing. God the Father, the Creator, the God of the Old Testament. God the Son, Jesus, died for our sins, New Testament. But the third part is the God that is within all of us, the thing that makes us separate and different from and better than, at least according to the Christian faith theory, than other animals, is that we all have a spark of God within us, the soul. And Christians call this divinity within the human soul different things. Sometimes the Holy Spirit, sometimes the Holy Ghost. And Hutchinson said, well, if we believe that there is this three parts of God, and there's the one that we don't see anymore who's up in heaven, and there's the one who walked among us and is now in heaven as well, after rising to heaven, um, and then we have this third part that's within all of us. If God is within us, then God can speak to us. And that part of God, that Holy Spirit that's within our souls, we should be looking for that. We should be listening for that. We should be focusing on trying to find that and let that speak to us and let that guide us. And that Holy Spirit, that spark of divinity, that part of God within each person, that is the thing that should guide our actions, because that's God that's within you and me. That's what Ann Hutchinson tells the people at the Bible study, at which point, if she's right, then first of all, why are they reading the Bible when they can sit around and wait for God to speak directly to them through their souls, through the Holy Spirit? But also, if she's right, then how do they know how they should act in all these other ways? Maybe God, the Holy Spirit, will speak to them and tell them to act differently than what the laws of their community tell them to do. Or maybe, and this is the deadliest fear of the leaders of the community when they find out about what she's saying, maybe people will go around doing whatever they want and explaining and justifying their actions. I was told to do this by the Holy Spirit. And if that happens, if many people believe that, and if many people then act on it, then it's going to lead to social chaos. Because if her ideas spread, not only are they not really going to believe in leadership, the leadership that's been chosen, but everyone is likely to just act any way that they want and follow any rules that they want and not truly follow the laws or rules of this society as they wait for or claim to be inspired by inspiration from the Holy Spirit. Well, ultimately, these ideas that spread rapidly throughout the colony, starting in 1636 and culminating in 1637, are just too dangerous for the leaders of the colony. And John Winthrop had Ann Hutchinson arrested and put on trial for heresy. Like Roger Williams, anti-religious sentiments, spreading evil ideas, basically, spreading irreligious ideas. Now, they're putting her on trial and accusing her of heresy, but partly because she's a woman, they also accused her of witchcraft. And one of the ways that they were convinced that they could prove that she was a witch, when she was arrested, she was pregnant. She's a pretty young woman still, still in her childbearing years. She was pregnant, and while waiting for trial, she had a miscarriage. Baby died within her womb. Terrible tragedy. One of the worst things that can happen to anyone, any woman, any mother, any family. A horrible, horrible tragedy. But the Puritan leaders of the colony used this miscarriage as proof against her. A witch, according to the religious theories, isn't just someone who, I don't know if you watch Sabrina or whatever, but isn't someone who just sort of like casts spells or, goes out and tries to live in the woods or, has a different relationship with nature or whatever. According to the ideas of Christianity, especially these strong ideas of the Puritan Christianity, a witch is someone who's made a pact with the devil. A witch is someone who has gotten powers from the devil as a result of literally being with physically the devil. In other words, sleeping with him, having sex with him, consorting with him. And the children that result, the devil spawn, are going to be demons that will walk the earth if they survive, because often, according to the theory, they cannot survive because the combination of a devil or a demon and a human form are just not going to survive. And so the death of her child, according to the Puritans, was proof that she had had sex with the devil, that she was a witch, literally a witch, who had consorted with the devil, and that the child in her uterus had not been able to reach conception because it was not viable, because it was an abomination. And imagine how that would feel to be a mother or someone who was going to be a mother and going through the horrible, horrible trauma, and then to be told that that's proof that you're evil. That's proof that your child was evil. That's proof that, that the whole community basically is coming down on her and saying, your child was an abomination. It's almost like they're making fun of her for having this horrible trauma happen to her. Well, in the trial that took place, Anne Hutchinson is accused of witchcraft and of heresy, and they throw out at her all these things that she's been saying. And yet, and we have the trial records and we can read them, they're fascinating. It's clear that the smartest person in the room and the most religious person in the room and the person who knows the Bible better than anyone else in the room is Anne Hutchinson. She's led these Bible studies because she knows what she's talking about. And although her conclusions are not things that they agree with, her explanation and justification, her biblical understanding is top notch. And you can read the trial transcript and you can tell how amazed Winthrop and the other judges who were going to pronounce her fate, how amazed they are at how much she knows. And they're just so impressed. They don't agree with her, but you can almost sense that some of them are beginning to waver because she's just so smart. She knows so much. Her understanding of the Bible and of their religion is so bedrock. And then at the last minute, and I still think she would have been found guilty anyway because her ideas were just so dangerous to them. But at the last minute, she announced that not only has the Holy Spirit directly spoken to her, but also so has God the Father, the God of the Old Testament, the God of Noah and of Moses. And God the Father has spoken to her and has told her who the saints are in their community. And she points to all the judges and says, God has told me you are not a saint. In other words, she's just told all the judges, all the leaders of the colony, that they're all going to hell because God told her so. Me, I might have waited until after the trial was over because these people obviously are now going to not think very kindly toward her, and not surprisingly, she was found guilty. Brief consideration should they execute her, but likely the plan is just going to be to banish her. At this point, Roger Williams has shown that sometimes it's just easier to get rid of people by not literally killing them. And so she and her family members and a small handful of people who support her left the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1637 after her trial was over. They went briefly to Providence, but she and Roger Williams don't get along particularly well, and so she continued farther down the coast. There is another splinter colony of Puritans that she's heard about on Long Island, because by this point, other Puritan groups are setting up all over the area with different versions of the Puritan beliefs. And so she's heard that these people may be a little bit better fit. Unfortunately for her, they're encroaching on territory that there's a Native American tribe who objected. There was a fight, and she and the people she was with were wiped out. So Anne Hutchinson doesn't even get what Roger Williams got. He got his own colony and he got to test some of his theories. And Hutchinson has not only this horrible miscarriage and the way the leaders of the colony treat it, but also gets a very brief period of freedom and then death. And was not really remembered very much until more recent decades. But again, a test case of how the Puritan colonies deal with someone objecting to or raising questions about their fundamental principles. And again, the answer to the question, how do they deal with it, is not that great. Now, things afterwards settled down for a while. There weren't the same kind of challenges or problems, I think, because either people had kind of figured out what they could say and what they could not say, or maybe they had sort of gotten rid of the most dangerous people among their community. Jump forward a couple of decades, by which point John Winthrop is no longer the leader, and this fairly mature Massachusetts Bay Colony, which had expanded into a good chunk of what is now modern day Massachusetts, with other Puritan colonies breaking away from it or establishing themselves separately in other parts of New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a pretty going concern by the 1600s, 1660s, a full generation after founding. But the surviving leaders of the founders were starting to bump up against a similar problem to what the separatist Puritans had run into in the Netherlands. And that problem is the kids. Because the second and then into the third generation of Puritans were not so strong in their beliefs as the original generation. Same story. Back in England, the Puritans in England had banded around themselves because of they were convinced they were right, and partly they were convinced they were right by the way everyone else objected to their ideas. Well, in these colonies, everyone's a Puritan. Everyone goes to the Puritan churches. The Congregationalist churches are crowded every week with people who believe and listen and support the church, which also means that it's not that much of a test. It's not that hard to be a Puritan. You don't have to fight as much for it. And the second and third generations just aren't quite as strong in their beliefs. And this especially is shown in the fact that not as many of the second and third generation are trying to become saints. The children of the saints are the only ones who get to be baptized or get to have communion. And so that's an important status symbol. But as those children and then later grandchildren, as they reach the time of age, when they can stand up before their fellow congregants and ask to be considered as one of the saints, one of the elite leaders of the community, fewer and fewer of them were stepping forward. And the reason for that is it's hard. It's not easy to do this emotionally wrenching thing of telling the story of your soul, of laying bare all your flaws and all your sins and all your mistakes and weaknesses. It's really hard to do that. And it's hard to do, especially when there's not as much on the line. Your parents are saints. You're okay. The saints, as we've seen, are the elites. They're the people, they have more land, they have more status. And the children and grandchildren of the original elites don't really feel the pressure is on them. And so some of them did, but it looks like the numbers are going to get smaller and smaller. And the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony started to get worried. We've established the ideal Christian society. We're going to show the rest of the world how to be Christian the right way. But it's only going to work if we know that after we're gone, there's still going to be leaders who are going to do the same things that we're doing. There need to be saints. There need to be saints next year and 10 years from now and 100 years from now. And if we're running out of saints, we're going to have a problem. Eventually, there's just going to be a bunch of English-speaking colonies with a bunch of churches. But it's not going to be that ideal Christian community that they wanted to establish. And so they got freaked out. Although their children and grandchildren are feeling the pressure from mom and dad and grandpa and grandma, it's not possible to turn this cultural change around. And so ultimately, the religious leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony decided that they had no choice but to accept a kind of middle standard for sainthood that would be easier for some people to get to, and therefore people would still go for it. In 1662, the religious leaders of the colony, set forth something that's called the Halfway Covenant. A covenant is like a contract, except it's religious. So a religious agreement among the churches, among the church leaders, but also an agreement with God, where if you were the child or grandchild of a saint, you could be baptized and your kids can be baptized without having to go through the sainthood process yourself. That may not seem like a big deal, but what it means is that they will continue to have at least enough baptized children, and therefore the possibility of future saints down the line, and therefore the possibility of an elite group of people who will be able to run the colony in future generations. But what it really means is that the leaders of the church, the leaders of the colony in Massachusetts Bay Colony, are accepting the fact that it's going to be harder and harder to get people to go as seriously and as heavy into the church as they had wanted, because the halfway covenant allows kind of a halfway status. They're going to have kind of a halfway leadership. In the future generations, they're accepting a watering down of some of their beliefs because they're accepting the reality that in future generations, it's harder and harder and harder to keep the same kind of strength of faith, to keep the same kind of strong community support for a very, very strict interpretation of religion and relationship with each other. From the halfway covenant on, you begin to see the Puritan colonies start to become a little bit less Puritan and a little bit more something else, which is still pretty religious, still religious based, but ultimately something a little bit different. By the 1700s, by the time of the American Revolution, the New England colonies are really not thought of as the Puritan colonies anymore. That's how they were established, but instead they're something else. Now let's talk a little bit about the Puritans because they get kind of a bad rap. Today, in movies and TV and other parts of the culture, when people are described as Puritans or when there's movies about the old days of the Puritans, it looks like they were really repressed. It looks like they were focused on punishing people. It looks like they're not a lot of fun to be around. And they do dress pretty prim and proper, and they do pray a lot. But the Puritans were not nearly as obsessed with some of the things that we might think of today as the sins that one might be going after. For example, the Puritans believed in sex. They take it very seriously. It's a big part of their lives. They have huge families, and there's only one way that can happen. They were convinced that as they're trying to expand their colony, that they have been given this empty wilderness, and again, they're ignoring the Native Americans, but they do. And their job was to establish a successful colony there, and they're going to follow the biblical precept of be fruitful and multiply. And it's not unusual for some of the Puritan families to have a dozen kids or 14, 16, 18. I've heard of 20 children. God help the women who are constantly pregnant, which means that obviously that there's a lot of sex going on. The Puritans believe that that is something that men and women do and that they should enjoy because it's something that's going to lead to children. What they don't believe in is sex out of wedlock. And they punish that in a similar way to the way the Franciscan friars had punished the Pueblo people when they had sex outside of the bonds of marriage. And so they're trying to crack down in the Puritan colonies on people who may have sex if they're not married. But their solution often is just when they find people, a couple who are having sex, they just try to get them to get married. And then so they can start the process of having Puritan families as opposed to wasting their time doing it outside the bonds of marriage, outside the sacrament of marriage. So they punish that. Fornication is not something that they would like to talk about, but sex, yeah, it's happening all the time. Kids come only one way. They also drink like crazy. I have some stuff to say about alcohol and American ideals of alcohol later, but take my word for it. Americans in the colonial days and in the early days of the Republic, they drank like crazy, way more than anybody you've ever met. The Puritans don't believe in drunkenness. They believe that drunkenness leads to sin because it leads to temptation, because you make bad decisions. But they have such a high tolerance because they're all drinking so much that getting to that level of drunkenness is something that a lot of them never have to worry about, even though they're drinking all the time. What they do believe in is they believe in making sure that other people do not fall prey to the many temptations of the flesh and of sin. Um, the Puritans are convinced that in their community, they're always under attack. And therefore, they're trying to fight temptation themselves, but they're also looking at their neighbors and constantly trying to find ways that that other person is falling apart. The idea, as one historian says it, of a Puritan who minds his own business is a contradiction in terms, because they believe they've been given this responsibility to establish the ideal Christian community, and therefore they need their community to be successful. Not only are they looking into each other's business, the Puritans are constantly suing each other. They're about as litigious as you can possibly find. In the early colonial period, they're constantly in court against each other, constantly fighting with each other, constantly picking at each other. That's partly because of a transition that's happening as they get into the decades that follow the early installation and creation of their colonies. They still got to live, right? They're Puritans, they're going to church, they're praying, they're reading their Bible, they're doing their Bible study, they're arguing about the best way to interpret the Bible. That's all happening, but you still have to live every day. and they need to find a way to live and be successful. Their goal is to be economically successful. Protestants, the Puritans, as a part of Protestantism, emphasize hard work and emphasize God is going to reward those who work hard. And so, therefore, standard of living and economic success is important to them. But it's hard to do that the traditional way that one might be successful up in New England because it's hard to be a farmer. There are a lot of farmers. That's what most people do at first. But New England is cold. New England has a rocky soil. New England has conditions that make it difficult to be a farmer and especially difficult to be a successful farmer. There will be some slavery up in New England, but it will never, except in a couple places in Rhode Island where there are some plantations, it'll never be a big business the way it was farther south because the conditions are just not possible. You can't grow tobacco or any of the other things that you can grow in large numbers and in large quantities. Instead, most of the farms up in New England are small, family owned farms where a family is going to do their best to scratch out a living and try to hold on and maybe sell a little bit to their neighbors if they have any surplus. If you drive through New England now, you can see evidence of what the difficult terrain that they had to deal with. You drive through some of the little country roads and you'll see these stone fences that line the roads or that separate different farms or different houses and neighborhoods and so forth. And that's stuff that's left over from the early colonial days. Before you can grow anything in New England, the first thing they got to do is pull all the rocks out of the soil because it's a rocky place and very difficult to grow things. So it's difficult. And the difficulty of making a living, first of just simply living, of actually finding something to grow, and then the difficulty of managing as as compared to the person in the farm next to you, led to an incredible amount of competitiveness. The Puritans are fighting the soil, they're fighting their conditions, they're fighting the temptations of sin, but they're also fighting against each other to try to find favor with God because they were convinced that God would reward the ones who work the hardest. And that's how they're comparing themselves. How am I doing? Well, do I have a little bit more than my neighbor? Do I have a little bit more than this guy? Um, so there's farming and competitiveness and ultimately business, all of which leads to a very competitive kind of New England style of economy. Eventually, although most Puritans are farmers, some of the people who began to pull away economically from everybody else were not farmers but were merchants. New England has some important harbors that became key ports in the trade between the colonies and England and ultimately the rest of the world. Boston, Providence, New Haven, Connecticut, and then a few others that a lot of the crops and other material goods that came out of New England came through there and got put on ships that are going to get sent back to England and ultimately to the rest of the world. If you run one of those shipping businesses, if you are supporting one of those businesses economically, if you're in the insurance business or a lawyer or someone else who's involved in that trade is really where most of the economy of New England funnels through those places, and there's ultimately going to be some wealth there. What really starts to happen over the decades is that either through that trade, which is happening in the key New England ports, or more broadly in the competitiveness of the difficult farming life throughout New England, the New England image starts to change and it shifts so that eventually the ideal New Englander, in their own mind as well as in the image that everyone else has of them, is not so much someone who goes to church every Sunday and prays, but instead the New Englander by around 1700 or so is someone who is going to get the best part of the deal, someone who competes in business, someone who is economically driven. Eventually, the stereotype of a New Englander by around the early 1700s is not the Puritan praying in church, but it's what everyone else calls the Yankee. The Yankee is someone from New England who is a shrewd business person, someone who is competitive on the open market, someone who will always get the better part of the deal. The farmers and business people farther south, the Chesapeake farmers, they're all convinced that they always get hosed when they have some sort of a business deal against someone from New England because the guys from New England are always just a little bit sharper than them. They're always a little bit more interested in finding the main chance. They're always a little bit more willing to sell somebody else for the price of half a pound of beans or whatever. Um, the Yankee ultimately becomes the image of the New Englander because economics changes who they are over the generations. They had to find a way to live. Trade became the shipping and commerce through the ports became where the wealth was, and competitiveness defined the rest of their communities. So ultimately, the Puritans sort of faded away, leaving behind important legacies, religious legacies, cultural legacies, and leaving behind a bunch of key New England colonies that will be part of as we begin to stitch together the whole English system that will someday be the United States of America. All right, in the next class, which will be on Thursday, we're going to try to fill in some of the gaps in between and then take our story forward a few decades. So I will see you then. Thank you for your patience. This is one long lecture, 2.5 hours, where we talked about religion and lots of isms. I hope you made it through. I'll see you next time.